Hi. This week, we're talking about the 2023 film, No One Will Save You. No One Will Save You. Wow, it was not the film I expected it to be, but I so enjoyed it. This is a film, it's available on Disney Plus, Hulu, depending on where in the world you're watching this. And it was given a theatrical release. It was released on the 19th of September, 2023. But just a few days later, on the 22nd of September of 2023, it became available on streaming. Written and directed by Brian Duffield. And it's such a cool film. I can only imagine the writer-director's delight when just a few days after it came out on streaming, no less than Stephen King himself posted about it on Twitter, saying, and I quote, "No one can save you. Brilliant, daring, involving, scary. You have to go back over 60 years to a Twilight Zone episode called The Invaders to find anything remotely like it. Truly unique." And boy, is that the case. And I know the episode of The Twilight Zone he's talking about. If you've never watched The Twilight Zone, make the effort to go and watch it. I think there's 6 seasons of it. I'll double check and put that on screen here. But it is such a brilliant show. Such a brilliant show, especially the first few seasons of it. And the episode he's talking about, The Invaders, it's one of my all-time favorite episodes. It stars the absolutely indomitable Agnes Moorehead, who is a classic golden era actress. She may be better remembered nowadays for playing in Dora, Samantha's mother in the TV series Bewitched, but she had a pretty stellar career before that. And not that that wasn't a great turn, just that she also had a big career in Hollywood before she moves to television. And one of the things that distinguishes this episode, and this is why Stephen King is referencing it in relation to No One Will Save You, is that there's no dialogue. We get this incredibly tense, action-packed thriller about a lone woman in a house with an alien invasion and no dialogue. And for a 25 roughly minute of a television episode, that's still daring, but it is doable. This is an entire feature film that maintains this feat. There are only 5 words of dialogue spoken in No One Will Save You. And they're pretty far into it. They're in the final act of the film, more or less at the emotional, if not narrative, although I would argue it's also the narrative climax of the film. I won't tell you what they are. I'm going to try and be as spoiler-free as possible with this, but I am going to have to do a little bit of telling you about what's happening, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum. Because I'm sure if you've not seen this film, you're thinking, well, how do we know about what anything is, who anybody is, what's going on, if there's no dialogue? The film is so clever about how it does this. We learn the main character's name. Her name is Bryn Adams, and we learn it from a couple of places. We see it on a note that she signs. She lives in this adorable little house. It's actually not a little house. It seems like it's a pretty decently sized farmhouse out in the country. And she makes and sells dresses online, presumably through something like Etsy. And she's signing a note to include, a thank you note to include in one of the parcels that she's getting ready to go into town to mail. And we actually see her sign it Bryn. Then later we see her in the graveyard next to a grave that from the dates you can more or less assume is her mother's grave, and you're correct to assume that. And it gives her name as Sarah Adams, so that's how we know that the main character's name is likely Bryn Adams, assuming the Adams part. And we learn other information like that through little bits of text here and there. Things, notes that are written, mailing labels, gravestones, notes on the bottoms of Polaroid photographs, that kind of thing. And it's so clever how we get all of this information. And the first part of the film is effectively, it's the last normal day of Bryn's life. Not the last day of her life, the last normal day of her life. And on the one hand, it seems absolutely picture perfect. As I say, she lives in this adorable house. She has this, really cool, creative career that she has formed for herself, and seems to be, supporting herself relatively well. We might guess that she has inherited the house that she's living in from her mother, so that certainly would help with her expenses, but she would still have, property taxes, utilities, things like that to pay, as well as, the expenses of just eating and living and running a business. And but she seems to be managing perfectly well at this. She has, a very sort of, I've seen a number of people describe it online as cottagecore, and I absolutely would agree with that. It's a very whimsical home, very, she lives, I have to say it again, in a very whimsical kind of way. And we see her in many ways really actively enjoying her life. And it is a pretty solitary life, but honestly, someone like me, I live at home. Obviously, I live at my home. I work at home. I live alone. I don't go out of the house very often, to be honest, for no reason. I'm not like agoraphobic or anything. I'm just busy and content. And, I think that's probably true of a lot of people who live and work from home, is they're probably homebodies. They only go out when they kind of have to. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything other than that they're very content at home. So personally, seeing how, alone she is for the first part of the film, it didn't surprise me in the slightest. It felt like, she was living her best life. But then as she gets in the car and is driving into town to mail her parcels, the first thing we start to notice is she, one of the things we see her do as she's getting dressed and ready is she kind of practices smiling and waving in the mirror, which, okay. There are all kinds of reasons why someone might do that. Neurodivergence, shyness, which is probably a form of neurodivergence. There are all kinds of reasons. But then when we see her actually encounter someone as she's driving and she sees someone in their front garden, and she stops her car and she waves out the open window, and they just turn away from her. They are not just ignoring, it's as if they are shunning her. And, we see this several more times. People don't want anything to do with her. They don't want to interact with her in any way. And, she quickly mails her parcels from an outdoor, big post box. And she, next thing we know, is sitting in a graveyard. And that's when we see, that she's there with her mother's grave. She just left the house with a bouquet of flowers. And now the flowers are in these vases. Oh, and when she's leaving the house, we also see her suddenly notice this sort of large-ish, maybe a meter across, ring of dried grass in her front garden. She, clearly that's new. But she, drags the hose over, gives it a quick watering, what else is she going to do? And next thing, she's on her way into town. But so, back to the graveyard, she is, on her way out of the graveyard presumably back to her car. And suddenly we see her, panic a bit and hide behind her car as we see this older couple sort of off in the distance, sort of middle-aged couple. And they, are being very kind, very nice, very affectionate toward one another, but you don't hear what they're saying. Again, this is a almost dialogue-free film. But we can see she is very distressed by the sight of them, and enough so that she actually hides, as opposed to the other people who she seems to try to engage with, even though they are shunning her. And, she goes through her day, and, later we see her sitting outside in her wonderful front garden. She's relaxing, she's enjoying her evening. She is writing a letter, and we see that she's addressed it to someone named Maud, and I saw your parents today. And what we learn, is that, something has happened. This is, and I won't go, we do find out what's happened, but I won't go into it here because, again, I don't want to do spoilers. But she does, something has happened, and we know in a little while that it's her fault because we see her finishing the letter, and she says, let me just to read it to you. I wish you could try something I've made. God, I miss you. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself. And then she addresses the envelope. She puts it in an envelope and addresses the envelope to Maud Collins. And then we see a Polaroid of two young girls, about 10, 11 years old, and it's labeled Maud and Bryn, BFFs. And this is next to her mirror as she's preparing for bed. And, she turns out her light, she goes to sleep, and then we get an overhead of her house. And this is actually how we first see her home, is that it's a home, sort of bungalow, cottagey type house, farmhousey type house in a clearing of a large forest. And, so we get that overhead shot again, but it's now dark and we're hearing strange noises. We're tracking, down to her door. Suddenly all the lights in the house come on. Her gramophone comes on downstairs. Everything suddenly turns on. Then they go out again. And she sleeps through all this. We see this as an audience, but she sleeps through it. But then she is awakened by this loud thump. And there's this odd sort of chittering sound, And long story short, she pretty quickly, when she goes to see what's happened, she thinks just, something has fallen or whatever. She realizes someone's in the house. Scary enough. And then she realizes it's some kind of alien creature. And, terrified, and we see shots of this almost in a way that we do see the full creature fairly quickly, but at first we just see outlines, shadows, distance, and at one point when she's hiding under the bed, we see its feet, and then they're almost like tree trunks, and instead of like a foot, like a human foot, a flat foot, or even a paw or a hoof, it's almost like the roots of a tree, and it kind of walks, almost like if you were walking your fingers across a table or something. It is super creepy, super weird. And of course, there's no mistaking it. And I don't think this is spoiling it because it's pretty clear, from the, if your sort of alien lore, that ring of grass that's dried out on her front garden, her front lawn, something has landed there that is probably alien. It's sort of a tiny reference to crop circles. And we do see from some other overhead shots that there's evidence that this is elsewhere around the town and out in the countryside. But she now realizes that her home is being, invaded attacked by aliens. And, they're similar to the kind of the Greys, as they're known, that are very prominent in a lot of modern alien folklore. And she is essentially having to try and figure out how to survive this, how to get them out of her house, how to survive. And at first, at dawn, she, manages to get away from the house, and she heads into town. And at first, everything seems really normal. And she goes to the police station. She's, I guess she thinks, I've got to tell somebody. But when she walks in, once more, she sees that couple. And and then the hatred that comes over the woman's face, Maud's mother, as we now know, and she spits in Bryn's face. And none of the police around do anything about it. They just, keep on with what they're doing. So she apparently doesn't say anything. She turns around, she leaves, and then she sees a bus go past after she has this kind of panic attack. And she gets, hopeful looking at this point. And next we see her, wearing a ball cap and sunglasses as if trying to hide her identity. And she's got a ticket for the bus. She's going to get out of town. But that does not work out. I won't say how. So she is forced to deal with this and go back to the house. And fairly quickly it becomes apparent that the townspeople are being taken over by these alien creatures. Okay. And the evidence of this is we see something that is under the skin of their throats, and it almost looks like some kind of spidery type creature at that stage. And so she's got to deal with these aliens. She's got to deal with the fact that there is no one out there to help her. That more and more they are coming after her. And long story short, I'm trying to think how to do this without spoilers. They become very curious, specifically about Bryn. They realize that this is someone who is very resourceful, who is able to kill. I won't say too much, but that is important. And when they do finally get her, they don't immediately try to take her. Well, they do try to take her over, but she gets away from that. And that makes them even more curious about her. And the end of the film, and all right, I'm going to give you the ending, but I'll there's going to be a spoiler alert sign on screen here so that you know if you don't want to hear how it ends, you can mute or whatever, or fast forward or whatever you choose to do. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. Right, they're gone. So the aliens realize, and I will go into this more in the non-spoiler section, that this is someone who is dealing with incredible grief for accidentally killing her best friend when she was still a child. And we don't know exactly what's happened in the intervening years, whether she served some kind of time for this or was put in some kind of mental institution. It was an argument between the two girls. They're very young. They're only about 12 years old. And she kills her friend during an argument. The friend pushes her down and she picks up a rock and throws it at her friend, and it's clearly killed her friend. And she's carried the guilt of that ever since, because this was her friend. And yeah, they were having an argument, but friends argue. And she's a child, so fully understanding the implications of what she was doing, obviously at that age, she's going to know what death is. She's going to know what, not to kill, but she's not necessarily going to understand that doing something like throwing the nearest thing to hand, which happened to be a rock, a sort of decently sized rock, that would be enough to kill her friend. So it's, but it is what happens, and she has dealt with this ever since, and we do know that she's now in her 20s, probably her mid-20s. We don't know exactly how old she is, but probably in her mid-20s. And she on the one hand, doesn't seem like much of a foe. And on the other hand, is one of the most complex, forceful people in the town, in the community. And rather than try to take her over, they let her go. They more or less sort of lower her and drop her from a ship onto the ground. And then when we get to the end of the film, it's suddenly she's part of the community. And everybody just loves her. And, she's kind of the center of this world. And she's just beamingly happy. But we notice that how people are dressed is now a bit different. It's more sort of her kind of vintage cottagecore retro-esque. We notice that the whole town is kind of like this now. It wasn't really before, but it definitely is now. And they're having this lovely sort of outdoor party, with lights festooned and all of that, like she has had at her home. And we see the sort of thing in their throats that indicates that they are all under the control of aliens, not Bryn, but the rest of the town. And the aliens have basically given her a happy ending. And at the end of the film, we see her actually break the fourth wall to look at the camera, look at this. And the camera pulls back. And as it pulls back and we see the sky above the town, we see a number of flying saucers, sort of drifting lazily around. And we get the sense that they have not only taken over the whole town, but obviously if they can be that brazen in their presence, they've probably taken over most of the area, if not maybe the world. And, it's as if they've decided she deserves more. Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1. We're back. Okay. So in terms of, for the non-spoiler part, in terms of what this film is dealing with, I think that it is about community to a degree, or the lack of community. I think it's therefore also about isolation. Not necessarily chosen, but enforced isolation. And it deals with major themes of guilt and of trauma, and in particular forgiveness, and not necessarily other people's forgiveness, but forgiving oneself. We have all made mistakes. We have all hurt people in one way or another. We have all done things that we are ashamed of or upset by, that we wish we could undo, but we can't. And, that is a form of trauma. Whether someone deserves that or not, that's another argument. And we can, you can have that discussion. But in this case, the implication is that not enough allowance has been made for how young Bryn was when she does this thing that she is so upset by. If you know the film, you know what it is, but that's the non-spoiler version. And that she is dealing with incredible guilt and shame. And she is trying to work through this. But up until that point, all that cheerful, whimsical happiness, it's more or less been a facade, and not for the townspeople. They don't see it. They don't care. They don't have anything to do with her. It's for herself. She is convincing herself that she is happy. And she's trying in her own way to deal with some of this, particularly through apparently writing letters to Maud. Even though, of course, she can't send them. Maud is dead. But she, this is something, we hear this from time to time as advice, if you're upset with someone, if you're angry with someone, if you need to tell someone something, whether they're alive or dead or whatever, write them a letter. You don't have to send it. Just the act of writing it should help. So clearly that is part of what she's doing. She is writing at least the letter that we see, presumably from the way it's sort of framed and all of that by the story, she's done this before. And this is about her processing her grief, her trauma, and her guilt. But what happens during the film is, on the one hand, Bryn becomes the final girl. And I think it's a really interesting twist on the final girl, because it's not just about survival, although she does certainly survive. That's part of being a final girl. But it's about, she's able to survive. She's able to retain who she is on top of surviving, because she is able to at last really confront her trauma, really confront her guilt, and then forgive herself and let it go. And that is incredibly, incredibly profound. And I think that's, beyond the suspense, and this is an incredibly suspenseful film. It's not paranormal, it's sci-fi, but with these sort of, it definitely has these Gothic themes of, the young woman isolated and having to save herself from a terrible threat. There is darkness in the sense of, literal darkness of the nighttime. A lot of this takes place in the dark at night, or hiding under things, so that, because obviously she needs to hide from these aliens who are incredibly powerful. But it is also about that sort of the shadow work that we all have to deal with sooner or later in order to be fully complete human beings. It reminds me of, this is something I've heard from a number of people, and it has certainly been my observation, that, well, people who write horror, and I think probably also people who write science fiction, particularly more sort of, dystopic science fiction stories, tend to be really happy, chill people. And I think a lot of that is because they get all of the fear, all of the traumas, all of the guilt, all of the shadow work. They get it out into their writing, into their creative writing. And, it helps them to deal with and process their fears, their traumas, their guilt, their shame, whatever. The more honest you can be, I think the better the writing is. And it gets it out of you. But, in this case, apparently just writing letters to Maud hasn't been enough for Bryn. She's got to take a more active approach in ways that mirror what happened in that original trauma, that original moment where Bryn effectively loses herself and loses her community and loses her friend and loses everything. And she's been getting it back, but in a very limited way. That by dealing very actively with what she has done, who she is, what she has to face about herself, she gets better. Now, the fact is, though, that, and this is light spoiler. I'm going to keep it as spoiler free as possible. In order to deal with that, or when she does deal with that trauma, the reward she's given, we have to question, is it real? I mean, in ways we know it's not. That this is a simulacrum of community. A simulacrum is a fake version of something. So the castle at the Magic Kingdom at Disney World, or the castle at the center of Disneyland Park, those are simulacra of real castles. They're not the real thing. They're made of well, certainly the Disney World one, I think, is predominantly made of, on the outside anyway, of fiberglass. The turrets actually come off, for, in case there's, for instance, a hurricane. A hurricane a coming, you got to take the turrets off the castle. It's not real. It's a simulacra. And that's what Bryn gets, is a simulacra of community, or simulacrum, to use the singular, of community. But she seems totally fine with that. And maybe this is about how desperate she has been for people, for community, that she will take this and run with it and be content. She has already, we see, for instance, she creates in one of the rooms of the house this huge model village, and in fact, early in the film, we see her receive a new piece, a new building for this that she's ordered from presumably another craftsperson online. And, it's all part of that very cute, kitsch life that she's living. But it's fake. It's a simulacra, or simulacrum. And at the end, that has expanded so that now there are people with her and she's dancing with them. She's interacting with them. They all seem to really, really like and love her. But is it real? Okay. And I think when she breaks the fourth wall at the end, that's a sign to us, the audience, that she's aware that it's not real. But she doesn't care. It's good enough. Okay. So no one can save you, or no one will save you. It is true. The title is doing some important work there. No one can save you but yourself. You are the only person who can fix you. You might get help from others, whether that's a psychiatrist or psychologist, or, just some friends who are really able to listen and give you great advice, or whatever it is. But ultimately, you are the only one who can save you. Okay? Bryn has to save herself, psychologically, emotionally, but also she is isolated in this alien invasion. She has to save herself from that too. It's an exciting film. It's a really fun film. It is such a cool film. I definitely recommend it. And honestly, I say, on this one, I'm giving it 5 out of 5. As I say, it's not paranormal, but it is effective. It is super scary in places, very creepy in places, very, very tense, very dramatic. And as I say, so clever, so deep, such an unusual film, and more than worth your time. As is The Invaders, the episode of Twilight Zone that Stephen King referenced when he wrote his tweet about it. And this was still Twitter days, I believe, 2023. So, yeah, go and look for that one too. So that's all I have to say. I will see you again next week for more analysis of films, television, novels, horror itself. Until then, though, good night, sleep tight, don't let the nightmares bite. Bye.